Hey, this is Coach Boydston, and in this screencast, we're going to be looking at the relationships of the wild. And wouldn't it be great if all the relationships looked a little bit like this, right? Just happy-go-lucky, all get along. The problem is most relationships in the wild look more like this. And so things are attacking each other and dying, and these relationships collide with each other. And so, and obviously all this happens in the environment. And when we talk about the environment of these organisms, we're talking about all the living and non-living things that make up the environment around these organisms. And a couple terms I want you to know here is going to be biotic, which is going to be the living factors within the environment. So if you're looking at these pictures, biotic things I see in there, the living things, you see the bobcat, the rabbit, the mosquito, the zebra, those are all living things in the environment, and they can interact together and affect each other. Abiotic is going to be the non-living things or factors in the environment, and so things like water or air, temperature, things that obviously are non-living, the soil. So those non-living factors in the environment will be those. So we have the living and non-living. Now we have a lot of relationships showing up here, but let's look at our four main ones. We call these four main types of relationships that can happen between organisms, we call them symbiotic relationships. Remember, biotic means living, and so it's a relationship between living organisms, so symbiotic relationships. One thing you'll notice about these four is anytime there's two organisms in some type of symbiotic relationship, there's always one benefiting from that relationship. It's what happens to the other one. So here you see species A is always benefiting for each one of these four, whereas for species B, there's something else happening there. So if we look at our first one, though, you have commensalism. Now, commensalism sometimes can be the hardest one to kind of lock down and figure out, but in commensalism, one organism is going to benefit and the other one's not going to be affected either way. So one organism benefit from the relationship, whereas the other one's not going to be harmed or benefited. So really no effect going on there to the other one. Now in the second one, mutualism, mutual means both. So in this relationship, both organisms are going to benefit from that relationship together. So both of them are getting something out of it as far as a benefit. The third one there is parasitism. Comes from a word meaning parasite, obviously. Sounds just like parasite. Parasitism is going to obviously harm one of them. And what parasites are anything that live on or inside of a host. And the parasite's going to be the one benefiting. They're going to at the expense of harming the other one. So in a parasitism relationship, one organism's benefiting, which is the parasite, like a mosquito, or say a tapeworm we'll look at here in a minute. It's going to harm the organism that it's on or in. The final one here is a predation, and it sounds a lot like predator. And so when you think of a predator-prey relationship, it's pretty obvious. The predator is getting a meal, and so he's benefiting. The one that's obviously harmed in this relationship is going to be the one that's getting eaten. And so predation, one benefits at the expense or life of the other, so the other one will be harmed. And so let's take some examples of these. The first one is commensalism. I have this bird here. It's called a cattle egret. These egrets, just so you can see in the picture here, they hang around cattle, and that's why they have that name. What they do is they hang around them, and the cattle, as they move around, will kick up the soil. They'll kick up insects, and these egrets feed on the insects that are kicked up when these cattle move. Now, just so you know, the egret is the one benefiting from the relationship. They're getting a meal. The cattle, they're really not affected. They don't get harmed from this relationship, but they also don't get benefited, which is our definition of commensalism. Our next one is going to be mutualism. Remember we said mutualism is where both of them are going to benefit. And so in this case, we have an impala here on the left, and he's covered in these birds. They're actually called a red-billed oxpecker. Fun word to say, right? What this oxpecker does is he feeds on little parasites like ticks and ants and things like that. So this impala is benefiting by having this red-billed oxpecker feed on him, feed on the ticks that are on his body and eat them off. Whereas the red-billed oxpecker is eating the insects and getting food. So much fun to say that word, right? So mutualism, they're both benefiting from the relationship. So mutualism, they're both benefiting. The next example is parasitism. And this is always the grossest one to think about. I read an article one time that said that every living thing on this planet has at least one parasite in it or on it at any given time. So, take that one home, food for thought. But parasitism is where the parasite, such as the mosquito, is going to benefit. It's getting blood from a host, and it's harming the organism that it's feeding on. Or like this tapeworm, something that's commonly found like in things like pork, if not cooked well. You could get a tapeworm, but it's a parasite that lives in the small intestines, and it feeds on nutrients as you eat. But that parasite is benefiting at the expense of the host that it's in. So in parasitism, one's benefiting, the other one's being harmed. And then the final one, which we said is really easy to identify, is predation. It's our predator-prey relationships. One organism's benefiting, the other one's being harmed. I think it's pretty easy to pick out the one that's benefiting from this two examples. You have the bobcat who's going to benefit from a nice rabbit meal. The rabbit obviously is going to lose its life in this battle. You have the great white shark and the seal. Great white shark is benefiting here at the expense of this seal. But obviously this predation relationship is a very, very common one in the wild. So that's our four main relationships that occur, but it brings me to one last topic, and that's this thing of competition. Organisms in the environment in the wild will have many relationships that we just discussed, but they're going to have to compete for resources. And we said at the first of this screencast that the resources or factors in the environment that are living things are going to be called biotic factors, whereas the ones that are non-living are going to be abiotic. So like if you look at this example of the crocodile, and we have the zebras and even some wildebeest in that picture, I can just imagine on the savannas of Africa, the rain is slowed, there's less and less water on the savanna, and this is a very small water pool that all of the animals are having to come to compete for as a resource, and there's just going to create a competition for that limited resource. And so another term that we can use here is called a limiting factor. So when a resource, whether it's biotic or abiotic, becomes in low numbers and it's affecting the ability of an organism to survive, we call that a limiting factor. And so in this case, we got organisms fighting over an abiotic factor, a non-living thing, which is water. Down here at the bottom, you have another example. You have an example that's really common, which is common competition within a species. You have two deer here fighting over probably what is a female to mate. And so they're going to have competition. The strongest male comes out, gets to mate with the female. And that kind of goes back to evolution we'll talk about in later screencasts, but it ensures that the best genes and the strongest male's genes get passed on to the next generation. And then if we look down here at this food web, what we have is we have some competition as well, and it's another common one, which is this competition over a particular type of prey. So in this case, if we look here at the mice, all right, the mice just happen to be the prey for the owl, the hawk, and the snake. And so if mice were to become in short supply, that would create competition between these three organisms for resources. Who do you think would be affected most by this competition with the reduction of mice? Well, if you're looking at it really close, you'll notice the hawk feeds on owls, mice, and rabbits. The owl feeds on frogs and mice, whereas the snake only feeds on mice. So I'd venture to say from this competition, this factor here, this biotic factor of these mice being in low numbers, this particular prey would be a limiting factor here for this snake, and it would really put a strain on the snake population within there because of that. The hawk, if there's mice are low, it can always go back to the rabbits or go back to feeding on owls. And so just that one organism being in low supply in the environment, it's going to create a fluctuation within the predators that feed on that. It's going to create competition and really have a big effect on the environment as a whole. So that was just the relationships of the wild. Hopefully that was beneficial to you. You guys have a good day.